Hi everyone. These are the notes that are going to introduce you to tissues and the major classes of tissues. So, what are the four major types of tissues? And sometimes we call it tissue proper, meaning like legitimate tissue categories, not weird blended tissue categories. What are the four major types of tissue propers in the body, and what are their important functions? Question mark. So, in these notes, we're going to cover the four major types of tissues, as well as special collection of tissues called membranes. During the course of the notes, we're going to cover these terms. In addition to that, we're going to cover membranes as well. Just forgot to list it in here under the key vocabulary, etc. So please recall, tissues are combinations of similar cells that work together to perform a special activity. Okay, so you'll have cells that are all very similar to each other, joined together, that often form the tissues. Your organs are ultimately made of many layers of tissues, of different tissue types, all working together to ultimately form the organ, whatever organ you're looking at. But we're just looking at single layers of cells that are very similar to one another and understanding what their physiology, their functions are. In the course of doing this, we're going to become what's known as histologists, people that study tissues. We're not going to really do it as intensely as I normally do it because we don't have access to microscopes while we're at home, but throughout this year, you're going to see samples of tissues, especially as we cover different systems, and you should be familiar with what the cells look like within the organs that we study. So here are some classic examples. This is what blood looks like. This is very typical for the lining of your intestines. This is what your muscles that move your arm look like. This is what the cartilage in the joints of your body look like. Stuff like that. So the four major classes of tissues are epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. Don't worry about writing this stuff down. It's actually going to come up again as we go over the different categories, A, B, C, and D. Okay? But I just want to kind of show you what they look like. So, nervous tissue typically is found in your nervous system. Your neurons, your spine, your brain, stuff like that. Muscles are associated with anything that's moving, actively moving stuff around, either moving your body around, moving your blood around, or moving liquids around. Connective tissue tends to connect, so it's about fluids that help cushion and bands that help attach things to your body are made of connective tissue. And epithelial typically is lining parts of your organs, either the inside surfaces or the outside surfaces of your organs. So like your stomach has the inside where all the stomach acid is and the outside of the stomach itself. Both of those are lined with epithelial tissue. Here's some examples of where you might find it. Find different tissues. So all of these are actually connective tissues. Well, this is nervous tissue, this is muscle, this is epithelial. Notice how there's so much more connective tissues in this diagram? That's because connective tissues are actually the weirdest class of tissues that's also the most abundantly found in throughout your body. Okay, so let's go over the first class of tissues, epithelial tissues. So epithelial tissues are tissues that line the surfaces of your organ, whether it's the hollow interior surface, meaning the interior of a hollow organ, like the inside of the tube of your blood vessels, or the inside of the tube of the intestines, or the inside pocket of your stomach, or the outer edges of the organ. Both of those are epithelial tissue on the edges. So the edge itself is called the apical surface. Apical just means the side unattached to any other tissues. They're either facing liquid or air. Okay? Now, there's three functions of epithelial tissues that they may serve, or they may serve all three things simultaneously. So these are all major functions of epithelial tissues. All right, so the first thing is it's used to help protect against damage. You'll have especially thick coatings, thick layers of epithelial tissue on surfaces that are going to get a lot of friction, a lot of abrasion. So you have really good epithelial layers on your outside skin, just layers and layers of dead epithelial cells to help protect you from like brushes against rough surfaces and stuff like that. If it's very thin layers that's on the edges of an organ, that organ might be really important to letting things flow through it. So you actually sometimes have maybe a single layer of epithelial tissue lining a hollow organ. So for protection, you might have lots of layers, while if you want to have stuff flow through a side and then kind of be used as like a sieve, as like a filter, almost like a cheesecloth, then you might have a single layer of cells lining a tube. You have this happen in your small intestines, which whole job is to absorb nutrients from the food flowing through your intestines and bring it into your bloodstream. And also, in addition to that, you may have some secretions. These secretions are basically, in addition to the cells lining it, some of these cells may pump stuff into a hollow or onto the surface. So your intestines, for instance, it's thin to allow stuff to be absorbed, but it also has cells within it that pump mucus all around the edges to help lubricate the edges so that food flows through it without damaging it too badly. You have mucus lining your lungs to help capture dirt and stuff. You also have this stuff lining your sweat glands to produce sweat. Secretions is just creation of materials that are going to be released into the outside or into like fluid, like even your blood counts as a secretion. Anything made by a cell so it can flow into your blood is a secretion. All right, so here are some examples of epithelial tissues. Notice always they're lining an edge. So you can have a single layer of tissues, this one, lining the very edge of the organ and facing the hollows. You can see another one, this lining the edge. This one you can't see so much, but the edge is over here. This one, the edge is fluid, but it's still not other tissue. Okay? In this picture, you can't really see the edge, but above it is air. Above this one is air as well, or fluid, etc. But just generally, it's either lining a tube or on the very edges. That's where you'll find epithelial tissues. If your teacher chooses to really dive into epithelial tissues, then there'll be a separate lesson going through all these types and what they do and where they're found. Okay, let's go over connective tissues. So connective tissues connect, protect, and support. Please add support in there. I made a mistake. All right, so this tissue type is the weirdest. It's got the weirdest diverse range of types of cells that look very different and have very different functions to one another. And they're also considered the most abundant tissue type in your body. Ultimately, they're still all classified as connective tissue because they actually all share a origin type of cell, meaning the stem cells, meaning mother cell that helps form it, all are the same. Okay, so they all have like a common like relative cell. They're more related to each other and how they're formed than any other type. Okay, so of the tissue types, you might have some that very much support the body and help hold things together or connect things to the edges of your body, to the hollows of your cavities. So your bones, your cartilage, your tendons, your ligaments all help attach your organs to the main structure. Some connective tissue types, in addition to help holding organs in place, also serve another purpose. So fat is often found to cushion your organs as well as to connect it to other tissues. But in addition to that, it also provides energy storage. White blood cells are wiggling throughout and found throughout connective tissues. Kind of, they like to swim through connective tissues to help protect you. But as a result, they play a really important role for immunity, meaning protection against diseases, and they're found within connective tissue types. In addition to that, they do a big job in transportation. So a big one is blood. So blood is considered a connective tissue. It's made of equal parts liquid and cells, and that liquid can be used to help move things around, and the cells within the liquid also help play a role in grabbing things and helping to transport them around your body, like oxygen. Some classic connective tissue types. You can have connective tissue types that help stick organs down to the edges, also known as loose connective tissue or areolar tissue. Fat count, so this is actually what fat looks like under a microscope. Dense connective tissue is kind of rubber band, ropey tissue that helps connect things down. So if you eat ever chicken bone and you grab a little piece of tendon and you know that tendon is glued down to the bone, that is a dense connective tissue. Cartilage, so that kind of chewy, glossy stuff on the edges of a chicken bone, if you ever eat that. This is the zoom in of what the cartilage may look like. This is the cartilage that's kind of at the ends of your bone. But these are all types of cartilage that you'll find between bone. Finally, bone itself is a connective tissue. It looks like this under a microscope. And this is classically what blood looks like under a microscope. The red blood cells help carry oxygen, and these guys are the white blood cells that help attack diseases. So all these pictures you don't have to take notes on. It's just to give you some familiarity and a reference in case it comes up in some slides for the histology assignments. Make sure you have this slide written down though. Okay, let's move on to the third major type of tissue, nervous tissue. So nervous tissue we'll go way more in depth on when we learn about the nervous system, but the nervous type of tissue are tissues that are involved in control and fast communication, particularly through electrical signals. A functional type of nervous tissue is neurons. Their job is to communicate with, I don't know why I wrote EA, it means each, other and other tissue types. So neurons kind of are the main rope, and they can stretch throughout your entire body. One neuron can span a meter or more sometimes. But ultimately, their job is to send a signal through it within less than a second so that it can jump to the next neuron. So the edge here that's first initially picking up the information that's coming in, that's first detecting something, like detecting pressure, detecting a scent, that's the edge that's called the dendrite. The middle section determines if the strength of the information coming in is worth it to send to the next part of your body. That's the cell body, okay? That involves the nucleus that helps process and go, ooh, is this a strong enough scent? Is this a strong enough pain sensation that I should send the information out? And then if the information is sent out either to another organ to cause a response, like to your heart to make it pump faster, or even to another neuron to send it off to your brain or to a foot or something like that, then it'll travel down this long stretch, which is called an axon. All these other bit players that you see around them, these are all cells whose main job is to keep the neuron healthy, alive, and functional. These cell types are called neuroglia cells. So before we move on to muscle cell types, I would like us to draw a basic neuron, okay? So the signal is going to travel down this way, and this is a neuron. All right? We're going to draw the most simplest form of a neuron. Ultimately, it's going to kind of look like this, but I'll draw a very simplified version. So my cheater's way of drawing a neuron is what I do is I kind of just draw like that kind of shape. I draw a line that looks like that, a tube line that kind of ends in a branching tipping point. On this part, that's a cell body, so I'm going to draw a nucleus there, and then I'm going to draw kind of like branches coming out of the corners. And that's it. Now I'm going to label it. Oh, I forgot to draw something, a special structure. So around the axon, you have layers of fat protecting it. So you always have these kind of beads on it. All right, now I'm going to label it. There you go. Kind of a helpful way to remember the order, it's the ABCD backwards. So ABCD or DCBA. So dendrite receives the information first, the cell body receives it next, and then the axon sends it out of the neuron to the next part. All right, let's move on to the last type of tissue, which is the muscle tissue. So its job is to create movement in the body through contractions. Contractions means your cells squeeze themselves to become a shorter cells, and overall that squeezing motion is going to help pull things around. So for example, one skeletal muscle cell may be this long if relaxed, And then quickly, if all the little bits inside of it, the stripes inside of it, squeeze, it may shrink as much as this small. So it's a cell that can change its shape by lining up the insides of the cell and pulling it inwards. Okay? That's what contraction is. So contractions is just a fancy way of saying squeeze. Okay, so the main functions of this squeezing for the muscles is to ultimately create motion of your skeleton to help move your body around, motion of liquids and fluid throughout your blood vessels or throughout your organ tracts, your digestive tract. You also will use muscles to help reduce stress on your body. So posture is actually really important. Having good posture will reduce stress along your skeletal muscle system, along your muscles, and this will actually produce less disability if you have good posture as you get older. The better your posture is, the less likely you're going to have a weird hunchback or weird injuries and muscle pain and stuff like that. Finally, muscles are really important for generating heat. So all your muscles are constantly generating heat, and the more you move your muscles, the more warmth you're going to produce in your body. So for example, babies need to be very protected and kept warm as much as possible, especially if it's cold outside, because their muscles aren't as developed, so they're not as good as shivering. So that's why your bodies actually naturally dump a lot of extra fat on a baby to help keep it a little bit warmer. So that's why babies are especially chubby. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over 3 types of muscle. And so we're going to go in muscles in way more depth than any other category. The connective and the epithelial tissues, if your class reviews it, if your unit is going to go over it in depth, then they will both be covered in their own separate lessons. But because there's only 3 types of muscles, we're going to cover them now. So the first type of muscle is called skeletal muscle. It's attached to your skeleton. Okay? The cells within this muscle are parallel to one another. So for example, if I want to draw another cell in this picture, I would draw another tube cell with its own stripes. The stripes are actually muscle fibers inside the muscle whose whole job is to, again, do that squishy motion and drag it inwards. Okay, so they're made of long cylindrical cells or parallel tubes. Okay. These cells are multinucleated, meaning they have more than one nucleus. The reason why that is they actually started as their own single cells, like that. And over time, they basically fuse together to create long tubes. And that can stretch out really long distances. They can stretch out sometimes a foot or more. Okay? They're striated. Those stripes are bands of fibers that allow motion. And this is the only of the 3 muscle types we're going to cover that's voluntary, meaning you can consciously control it. You can make a decision to move it. The other 2 muscle types you can't consciously decide to move. Finally, because of the way it's developed, because of that weird fusion, what actually ends up happening is it's really hard to repair itself. It can't really regenerate. So regenerate is the act of making new cells. So it has a hard time making new cells if it's damaged. So if you tear a muscle as an adult, you'll have a really hard, the big tears, like fully pull it apart, need surgery to stitch it back together. If that happens, basically that muscle is going to be way weaker for the rest of your life because the ripping will have permanently damaged many of the cells, and they can't really replace themselves. Okay? So, have that written down, and then either draw a muscle cell or at least make sure you know and have access to an image of the skeletal muscle cells. All right, so here's a bunch of microscopic images of muscle cells. So all of them are different colors because the stains that were used on them were slightly different. Okay, so just a heads up, the colors you see in slides are not the real colors of what it is in your body. All these slides are stained with chemicals to make the elements more visible. However, even though they're all different colors, you can see main elements. They're all tubes. They look kind of like gummy worm tubes almost, and they all have these ripples inside of them. That's how you know it's skeletal. Also, when you zoom in, the tubes are very large. There's some other tissues where you can kind of see tubes, but when you zoom in, they're like, you can only see stripes or not stripes, but like very thin ropes, but you can't see separate tubes. If you zoom in and there's no separate, very visible tubes, it's not skeletal muscle. Okay? The stripes are called striations. You can also see these things. Those are the nuclei. Okay? So, nuclei is nucleus, meaning more than one nucleus. Okay, the second type of muscle tissue is called cardiac muscle. So, cardiac muscle is found in the heart, and it's also striated. So, whenever you see striated is going to mean fast, meaning fast motion. Okay? But in this case, unlike skeletal muscle, it's involuntary, meaning you can't make a decision to control it. Now, something unique about cardiac muscle that's not found in any other muscle is it's branched, meaning the cells are joined up together, okay? And they spread out at what's called intercalated discs. So this picture kind of sucks, but that I drew over here. But basically, imagine these as separate cells, and then they have kind of thick wriggles between them. Each of these thick wriggles are basically stitches that help tie the cells together but still keep them their own cell. But these weird ties produce connection points that actually allow each of these cells, so ultimately every cell in your heart is connected to another cell, so ultimately they're all kind of woven together so that if one pumps, you could send an electrical signal through all the cells simultaneously, so all of them squeeze at the same exact moment. So the pumping motion of your heart, the fact that it's all coordinated, is thanks to the stitching, these branches. And the actual stitches, the little connection points themselves, are called intercalated discs. And those are the things that allow you to squeeze at the same time. Like your skeletal muscle, you can't really regenerate your heart, which is why when you get a heart attack or a heart stroke, your heart is permanently damaged, permanently weakened. All right? And it has only one nucleus because you're stitching the cells together, you're not merging the cells together. So they're still separated, just connected. Slightly better way of drawing your cardiac muscle. So again, draw it out or have a reference. You can also, like I said, you can branch it. So this could be another branch, for instance, of the cardiac muscle. But remember, there's always one nucleus. Okay? So here are some microscope images of cardiac muscle. All right, so this one's a little bit trickier and kind of hard to see. But the fact that you can see ropes, again, the tunnels, and they're not parallel, and you can kind of see branching like this. This one's really hard to view, but you can kind of see it on the edges. But this is the easiest and most obvious cardiac one. This one's also not too bad. All right, the last kind of muscle cell type is called smooth muscle. So, unlike the other two, the biggest difference is it doesn't have stripes, it doesn't have striations, and as a result, it's going to be a lot slower. In addition to that, like cardiac, it's involuntary. So this slow, unconscious motion is a huge advantage in terms of moving fluids and food through your body. You don't want to make a conscious decision of, oh, let me just inch this bread through my stomach and down my intestines for the next 24 hours. That would suck. You want to unconsciously have your brainstem do that work, and you don't have to think about it. Okay? You also need this flow to go through slow enough so that you can absorb whatever you need through these fluids that are flowing around, your blood or your or food nutrients and stuff like that going through your intestines. Okay? So that's why the non-striation is very helpful. As a byproduct, because it doesn't have to be coordinated, because it's not striped, because it's not made to fuse together in weird ways, either through fusing into one giant cell or stitching together, it ends up being allowed to regenerate. because the cells are separated and there's nothing weird about those, the way they're connected, you can actually repair it, which is very helpful. So if you get damage in your intestine, if you get damage in your lungs, some of it can grow back and heal itself over time. The shape is basically something called tapered. So what tapered means is the edges are pinched in a little bit. So it looks kind of like a little fluffy in the center and a little more narrow on the edges. Okay? So that's what tapered is. But all the cells in smooth muscle are tapered, so it ends up looking like this. In terms of the microscope and what it looks like under a microscope, let me show you that image. So just make sure you write all this down. And then pause it if you are a little bit behind. So this is actually what smooth muscle looks like. Now the big thing is you might confuse it with epithelial tissue because you see layers and layers of it like epithelial. But the biggest difference between smooth muscle and epithelial tissue is, one, you can't see a free edge. You can't see an empty edge on either side of the smooth muscle. Probably if there's anything on either edge of the smooth muscle, it's additional tissue. Okay, so smooth muscle is always in between tissue layers of other stuff. The second thing that's unique about it is there's no variation in what they look like within this section of smooth muscle. Meaning the top smooth muscle cell doesn't have a weird difference to the bottom smooth muscle cell. You're not going to see that clean uniformity within epithelial tissues that kind of look pancakey. So what do I mean by this? This is squamous layers, meaning layers of epithelial tissue, and this is smooth muscle cell. A lot of students think this is epithelial tissue, but again, it's sandwich. It's not on a free edge. This one super has a free edge, and two, these layers are uneven as heck. They're super uneven and funky. While the smooth muscle layer, you can see the nucleus nice and clear, and it's very even. All right, so let's summarize the muscles. Skeletal, the big thing is all about movement and heat generation and movement of the skeleton. Unlike the other two, it's the only one that has many nuclei. Its shape is long, cylindrical, and striated, and you can consciously control it, but you can't easily repair it. Cardiac lets you pump blood with your heart. You usually only have one nuclei. It's branched and has intercalated discs, and it's striped to allow fast movement. But unlike skeletal, it's involuntary, meaning you don't consciously decide to move your heart, which is good because your heart beats so fast you don't want that responsibility. And again, if it gets damaged, you can't repair it. While with smooth, it's the only one where you can repair it. It's involuntary like cardiac, but unlike the cardiac and skeletal, it's the only muscle type that doesn't have striations, which means it moves a lot slower. It also has taper shape. And as a result, because it has slower movement, it's really responsible for the movement of materials in your hollow organs to help create that more controlled, slower motion. Here are additional images of muscle cell types if you want to see a cleaner version of the way it's drawn in a cartoony form, and additional ways of what it looks like under a microscope. All right, the last weird thing about tissues we're going to cover is something called membranes. So membranes are the special layers, so it's more than one tissue type that you typically find on the edges of the organ. All right, so they're special structures that we call the edges of the organ, and we use it to refer to the epithelial tissue and the first layers of connective tissue that hold the epithelial tissue down. So the job of membranes is to kind of together support and separate and create those secretions. So basically, it's the epithelial and connective functions together in one. Generally speaking, if you're going to draw typical membrane layers, you have the epithelium layer first. It might be made of more than one cell layer. It might be made of only one cell layer. You're going to have the connective section that helps glue basically the epithelial down onto connective tissue underneath. But this whole thing is considered a membrane. So here's some examples of membrane types. Mucous membranes, line up anything that makes mucus. So inside your nose, inside your lungs, those are all hollow organs that have to face or take in stuff coming in from the outside. So it's internal surfaces, meaning surfaces inside your body that you want to keep moist, but you also have to expose to stuff coming in from the outside. So as a result, you need mucous membranes to help trap in dirt coming in from the air. You want mucous membranes down your digestive tract to help lubricate food coming down and protect the edges from the rough surfaces of your food. You have it inside your reproductive system, again, to prevent stuff that's coming in from getting inside your body and going into your blood. You also have it in your urinary system. So I didn't write all the areas you have mucus lining, but you basically have it anything that's poking and has the potential to have stuff from the outside come in and potentially infect your body. That mucus traps stuff that's coming in and prevents it from going into your blood and going into other parts that you don't want it to get into. Cutaneous membrane is the outside membrane in your body, your skin. So it's basically the layers of your skin are actually all also nicknamed the cutaneous membrane. So your skin has the outside edge, which is epithelial, and the inside layers where you have blood and fat, that is connective tissue, right? Attached and directly glued to the outside dry dead skin parts. And finally, another example of membranes is a serous membrane. So if you look at the outside of the organs, on the edges of the organs is kind of flat, smooth, and glistening. Those are actually serous membranes whose whole deal is to produce slight bits of fluid to reduce friction as your organs shift inside your body. So it's lining the surfaces of your internal visceral organs. You have a serous membrane, for example, lining the outer edges of your lungs. And there's many other more membrane types that you may learn in future units, but these are just 3 examples. All right, key takeaways. Histology is the study of tissues. The 4 main categories of tissues we reviewed today were connective, epithelial, muscle, and nervous. The big thing with epithelial is about protecting and creating barriers for protection and creating secretions. Connective tissue is all about support, protection, and attachment of stuff, while nervous tissue is about communication through electricity to control your body. We really went into depth on muscles, which are the main tissue type for transportation and movement. And in this case, you're going to use skeletal muscle for fast, conscious movement of your body, and in particular your skeleton, for helping you walk and move and all that stuff. Smooth muscle is not as structured, meaning it's not as striated, it doesn't have as many stripes and as many fibers, and as a result, motion is a lot slower, but it's very useful for helping to do slow transport of material gradually through your body, while cardiac muscle is all about pumping blood quickly so you get oxygen everywhere that it needs to go. And in this case, you need a nice, strong type of tissue, cardiac muscle tissue, to help create that fast motion. Membranes are not tissue types, but they're collections of epithelial and connective tissues that line and protect together. All right, so that concludes the notes. Move on to any other work you have. Bye.